Imagine standing on a low ridge above the River Severn sometime around the year 910 AD. The air smells of wood smoke and river mud. Below you, a settlement is taking shape, not growing organically the way villages do, slowly and without intention, but being built, deliberately, according to a plan. Timber palisades are going up along a surveyed line. Streets are being cut in a grid. A garrison is being positioned at the gate. This is not a village growing into a town. This is a town being created by an act of will, by someone who understood that the difference between a defended position and an undefended one could determine whether the people living there would still be alive in 10 years. The person directing this was a woman. Her name was Æthelflæd. She was the daughter of Alfred the Great, the wife of the Lord of the Mercians. And after her husband's incapacitation, she governed Mercia herself, not as a regent waiting for a male heir to come of age, but as the effective ruler of one of the most strategically important territories in early medieval England. She built towns. She commanded armies. She negotiated with Welsh kings and Viking leaders. And she did all of this in a period when the political map of England was being redrawn, violently and permanently, by a conflict between the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms and the Scandinavian settlers, who had carved out their own territory across the north and east of the country. This video is about Æthelflæd, but it is also about the towns she built, what they were, why she built them where she did, what life inside them looked like, and what happened to those places after she was gone, because several of them still exist. Now, you can walk their streets today, and almost no one who does so knows whose decision it was to put them there. Let's establish the world Æthelflæd was born into. The year is approximately 870 AD. Alfred, not yet the Great, not yet even king, is fighting for survival. The Great Heathen Army, a coalition of Scandinavian forces that had arrived in England in 865, has spent the better part of a decade dismantling the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms one by one. Northumbria has fallen, East Anglia has fallen. The kingdom of Mercia, which once dominated the center of England, has been partially overrun, and its king has fled into exile. Wessex, Alfred's kingdom, is the last major Anglo-Saxon polity still resisting. Into this world Æthelflæd was born, probably around 870, though the exact date is not recorded. She was Alfred's eldest child, and she grew up in a royal household that was simultaneously a military headquarters, an administrative center, and, unusually for the period, a place where literacy and learning were actively cultivated. Alfred was deeply committed to education. He translated Latin texts into Old English. He established a court school. He brought scholars from the continent and from Wales to his household. His children, including Æthelflæd, were educated in this environment. What that education actually consisted of for a royal daughter in 9th century Wessex is not fully documented. We know from the Chronicle of Asser, Alfred's Welsh biographer, that Alfred's children were taught to read, in both English and Latin, before they were taught anything else. Beyond that, the specific curriculum Æthelflæd received is not recorded. What the historical record does show, however, is what she was capable of as an adult. Strategic thinking, administrative organization, diplomatic negotiation, and a sustained program of urban fortification that required logistical planning on a significant scale. Whatever her education was, it prepared her for something more than domestic management. Around 886 AD, when Æthelflæd was probably in her mid-teens, Alfred arranged her marriage to Æthelred, the lord of the Mercians. This was a political alliance of considerable importance. Æthelred was not a king. He governed Mercia under Alfred's overlordship, as a lord rather than an independent ruler. The marriage tied Mercia firmly to Wessex and created a unified front against the Scandinavian territories to the north and east. It was the kind of marriage that medieval dynasties arranged constantly, trading daughters for alliances. But what made this particular arrangement historically significant was not the marriage itself. It was what Æthelflæd did with the position it gave her. She and Æthelred governed Mercia together. Charters from the period, legal documents recording grants of land and privileges, show both their names, sometimes Æthelred's first, sometimes Æthelflæd's. This co-governance was not ceremonial. The documentary evidence suggests she was actively involved in the administration of the territory from early in their marriage. And when Æthelflæd became seriously ill, probably sometime around 902 to 904 AD, though the timeline is uncertain, it was Æthelflæd who assumed effective control of Mercian governance. She is referred to in sources from this period as Merkna Hlefdeish, the Lady of the Mercians. It is a title that sounds deferential but functioned in practice as a designation of sovereign authority. She held that authority until her death in 918. In those roughly 15 years of effective rule, she oversaw the construction or reinforcement of at least 10 fortified settlements, burhs, across Mercia. Each one was positioned with clear strategic logic. Each one became a nucleus around which urban life organized itself. Several of those places are cities today. To understand why this matters, you need to understand what a burh actually was, and why Alfred's system of fortified towns was one of the most consequential administrative innovations in early medieval English history. When the word burh simply means an enclosed or fortified place, but Alfred's burhs developed systematically from the 880s onward and documented in a remarkable administrative text known as the Burgal Heidage, were something more specific. They were garrisoned, planned settlements positioned at regular intervals across the landscape, close enough that no point in Wessex, and later Mercia, was more than a day's march from a defended position. The logic was military. If Viking raiding parties could not move through the countryside without encountering a fortified town capable of mounting resistance, their ability to plunder and control the territory would be severely degraded. But the burhs were not purely military installations. They were also markets, administrative centers, and mints. They attracted population. Craftspeople and traders moved inside their walls because walls meant safety, and safety meant the ability to conduct business without being robbed or killed. The burh system, in other words, was simultaneously a military strategy and an urban policy. Alfred understood, and Æthelflæd clearly understood after him, that fortification and economic activity were not separate concerns. A town that could defend itself was a town that could sustain commerce. A town that sustained commerce could pay for its own defense. This insight, which seems obvious in retrospect, was not universally grasped in the 9th century. It required someone with both military and administrative intelligence to implement it consistently across a large territory. Alfred did it for Wessex. Æthelflæd did it for Mercia, and she did it under conditions of active military threat, coordinating with her brother Edward of Wessex to the south, managing relations with the Welsh kingdoms to the west, and pressing against the boundaries of the Danelaw to the north and east. Let us look at the specific towns Æthelflæd built or significantly fortified, because the geography of her decisions tells us something important about how she read the strategic landscape. The Mercian Register, a chronicle source that records Æthelflæd's activities in unusual detail for a medieval woman, lists the burhs she established year by year between approximately 910 and 917 AD. The list includes Bremisburh, Surget, Britnorth, Tamworth, Stafford, Edisbury, Warwick, Cherbury, Weirdburh, and Runcorn. Among some of these places have vanished or remain unidentified. Others are still cities. Tamworth, Stafford, Warwick. These are towns you can visit today, and their origins as deliberate fortified settlements created under Æthelflæd's authority are documented. Take Tamworth. In 913 AD, according to the Mercian Register, Æthelflæd built a burh there. Tamworth had been a significant Mercian royal center before the Viking disruptions. It was where Mercian kings had held court, where royal assemblies had met, where coins had been minted. By the early 10th century, it had been damaged and its administrative functions disrupted. Æthelflæd's decision to fortify Tamworth was partly about restoration, reclaiming a place of Mercian symbolic importance, but also about practical positioning. Tamworth sits at the confluence of the Tame and Anchor rivers, a natural defensive site in a node in the river-based transport network of the Midlands. A fortified town there controlled movement across that part of the landscape. Stafford, fortified in 913 as well, was positioned on a sandstone ridge above the River Sow, another site where topography offered natural defensive advantage and where a garrison could monitor the approaches from the north. Warwick, established the following year, sat on a dramatic sandstone cliff above the River Avon. These were not random choices. Each location reflected a clear understanding of terrain, water, and movement. What did life inside one of these newly established burhs actually look like in the early 10th century? And the physical layout would have been defined first by the defensive circuit, the bank, ditch, and timber palisade that formed the perimeter. Inside that perimeter, the street plan was typically regular, sometimes following a grid, with a main thoroughfare connecting the principal gates and subsidiary streets running perpendicular. Archaeological work in towns across Wessex and Mercia has revealed evidence of this planned street layout in settlements that were established during the burh building period. Housing within these early burhs was overwhelmingly timber-framed. Stone construction was reserved for significant religious buildings. A minster church was typically a feature of a burh, serving both spiritual and administrative functions, since the church was the primary institution capable of keeping records, maintaining literacy, and administering oaths. The houses of ordinary inhabitants were post-built structures with thatched roofs, earthen floors, and hearths at their centers. They were small by modern standards, typically a single main room, perhaps with a separated sleeping area or storage space. Multiple generations of a family might share such a structure. The population of an early 10th century burh was not large by the standards of what we would call a city. A newly founded settlement like Stafford or Tamworth in 913 AD might have housed a few hundred people inside its walls initially. The garrison itself, the families of soldiers, craftspeople who had been encouraged or directed to settle there, traders who recognized the commercial opportunity, a minster with its associated clergy and servants, possibly a small market. But these places were designed to grow. The burhs, the administrative document associated with Alfred's burh system, calculates the length of each burh's defensive perimeter and the number of men required to defend it, at a rate of 1 man per 5.5 feet of wall. This means the document implicitly tells us the intended size of each settlement. The calculations for Mercian burhs suggest that some were planned at scales larger than their initial populations would fill. They were designed with expansion in mind. That expansion happened. Markets established at burhs attracted traders from the surrounding countryside. Craftspeople, smiths, potters, leather workers, bone carvers, settled near markets because that is where customers were. The documentary evidence for craft activity in 10th century English burhs includes archaeological finds of metalworking debris, pottery kilns, and leatherworking tools in quantities that indicate sustained production, not just occasional activity. These were functioning economic centers within a generation of their foundation. The military context in which Æthelflæd was building these towns is essential to understanding them. She was not constructing peaceful market towns in a stable political environment. She was building fortified positions in an active conflict zone, and she was also conducting offensive military operations simultaneously. The Danelaw, the territory under Scandinavian political control, was not a fixed or passive entity. It was governed by a complex and sometimes fractious collection of Viking leaders in different towns: Derby, Leicester, Nottingham, Lincoln, Stamford, York. These were themselves urbanized settlements, many of them built on or near Roman sites, governed by Norse-speaking elites who had developed their own administrative and commercial systems. The boundary between Mercian-controlled territory and Danelaw territory was contested, and military pressure ran in both directions. Æthelflæd's building program was coordinated with offensive pressure against the Danelaw towns. In 917 AD, she captured Derby, described in the Mercian Register as the first of the 5 boroughs to be taken. This was a significant military achievement, accomplished through a siege operation that required organizing and supplying a substantial force. The Chronicle notes with unusual specificity that 4 of her thegns, her senior military retainers, were killed fighting within the gates. This detail suggests hard fighting at close quarters and implies that Æthelflæd was directing an assault, not merely a blockade. In 918 AD, Leicester submitted to her authority without significant resistance. The Chronicle suggests that the population there negotiated a settlement, possibly because the military situation had shifted sufficiently that resistance seemed futile. And in the same year, the Norse leaders of York reportedly sent word that they were prepared to accept her lordship as well. York, the most significant Viking urban center in England, submitting to a Mercian noblewoman would have represented a transformative political moment. Æthelflæd died before that submission could be formalized. She died on 12th of June 918 AD at Tamworth, the city she had herself fortified 5 years earlier. She was probably in her late 40s. The cause of her death is not recorded. Her death created an immediate political crisis. She had a daughter, Ælfwine, but Ælfwine was quickly removed from power by her uncle Edward of Wessex, who absorbed Mercia directly into his own kingdom within months of Æthelflæd's death. The independent Mercian political entity that Æthelflæd had governed effectively ceased to exist. Mercia became part of what was becoming, under Edward and then Æthelstan, the unified kingdom of England. What the historical sources say about Æthelflæd is fragmentary, as it is for almost everyone in this period. But what survives is revealing in its specificity. And the Mercian Register, embedded within the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, records her building activities and military campaigns in a year-by-year format that is unusually detailed for a non-royal female figure in early medieval England. That detail itself is historically significant. Someone thought her activities were worth recording systematically. Whether that reflects a Mercian scribal tradition that was more attentive to her role, or a deliberate effort by someone close to her to document her achievements, we cannot say with certainty. But the record exists, and it is substantially more specific than the coverage most of her contemporaries received. The Welsh chronicle Annales Cambriae mentions her. Irish annals mention her. These references from sources outside the direct Mercian and West Saxon political sphere confirm that she was a figure of sufficient importance that neighboring polities tracked her activities. The Irish annals in particular call her Queen of the Saxons, a title she was never given in English sources, where she remained Lady of the Mercians, but one that reflects how she was perceived from outside. Continental sources do not mention her directly, which is consistent with the general pattern of how insular British affairs were recorded on the continent in this period, sporadically and often with minimal detail. But the network of diplomatic contacts that connected the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms to Carolingian and post-Carolingian Europe during Alfred's reign and after means that her governance of Mercia would not have been entirely unknown to continental observers. What is largely absent from the sources is any substantial account of her inner life, her personal relationships, her appearance, or her private concerns. We know she and Æthelred had at least one child, Ælfwine. There is a statement in one later source that after Ælfwine's birth, Æthelflæd refused to have further sexual relations with her husband, reportedly saying that it was unseemly for a king's daughter to give herself to pleasure after she had once experienced the pain of childbirth. Whether this represents a genuine documented statement, a later hagiographical embellishment, or simply a narrative constructed to explain why the couple had only one recorded child, historians disagree. It is not reliable evidence about her actual views on marriage or sexuality. What we can say is that she governed effectively alongside and then in place of her husband, and that the co-governance visible in the charter evidence suggests a working political partnership rather than a ceremonial one. Now consider what her towns became. Warwick today is a market town of around 31,000 people. Its castle, dramatically positioned above the River Avon, is one of the best preserved medieval fortifications in England, though the castle as it currently exists is largely Norman and later not the original burh fortification. The street plan of the old town, however, retains traces of the early medieval layout. The high street and its relationship to the river crossing reflect the logic of the original defended settlement, where people walked those streets without any awareness that the decision to put a town there was made by a Mercian noblewoman in 914 AD. Stafford is a county town of around 70,000 people. Its position on the sandstone ridge above the Sow is the same position Æthelflæd chose for her fortification. The later medieval town, with its market, its castle, its parish churches, developed from the nucleus she established. The current street plan of Stafford's town center preserves, imperfectly but detectably, the orientation of the early burh layout. Tamworth, perhaps the most symbolically significant of her fortified towns, given its prior importance as a Mercian royal center, is today a town of around 77,000 people in Staffordshire. A statue of Æthelflæd stands there, one of the very few public monuments to her anywhere in England. It was erected in 1913 on the 1000th anniversary of her fortification of the town. The statue shows her with a sword and a young child, the child representing Mercia, not her actual daughter, which is a Victorian Edwardian interpretive choice that tells us more about early 20th century ideas about female leadership than about the historical Æthelflæd. But the statue exists, and it stands in the town she built. Chester, which Æthelflæd also fortified, the source's record work there in 907 AD, is today a city of around 80,000 people, whose Roman street plan is still dramatically visible. The Roman walls, substantially rebuilt in the medieval period, are still walkable. The grid of streets inside those walls, Eastgate Street, Northgate Street, Bridge Street, and Watergate Street follows the Roman layout that defined the site long before Æthelflæd's intervention. Her work there involved restoring and extending a fortification on a site with over 1,000 years of prior urban history. Chester is one of the clearest examples in England of urban continuity across radically different political regimes. What does Æthelflæd's career tell us about urban development and the human forces that drive it? Several things, each worth dwelling on. First, urban development in this period was a deliberate political act. The towns she built did not emerge organically from population growth and commercial activity. They were created by a decision. A specific person, at a specific moment, chose to put a fortified settlement in a specific location for specific strategic reasons. And the urban form followed from the political and military logic. This is a reminder that cities are not natural phenomena. They are the products of human choices, and those choices are embedded in the structures that outlast them by centuries. Second, the administrative and military dimensions of urban planning were inseparable in the early medieval period. A town that could not defend itself could not function as a market or an administrative center, because it would be raided or destroyed. Æthelflæd understood this integration completely. Her building program was simultaneously military policy, economic policy, and territorial policy. The towns she created were instruments of governance, not merely places where people happened to live. Third, the role of individual agency in urban history is real and documentable. Æthelflæd was not an inevitable product of impersonal historical forces. She was a specific person with specific capabilities, operating in a specific context. And the towns that exist because of her decisions would not have existed in the same form, in the same places, at the same time, without her. That is not romanticization. It is what the documentary and archaeological evidence supports. Fourth, the erasure of women from urban history is a product of how sources were written and preserved, not of their actual absence from the processes that created cities. Æthelflæd governed Mercia, built its towns, commanded its armies, and negotiated its diplomatic relationships. She did this in the early 10th century, in a period that is often characterized as one of relentless male martial activity. The Mercian register preserved her record, partially. Other women whose decisions shaped early medieval urban development are entirely invisible to us, not because they did not act, but because no one recorded what they did. Walk through Warwick on a clear morning, stand on the castle bridge above the Avon, and look at the town spread out behind you. The castle is Norman, the parish church is medieval, the market square was shaped by centuries of commerce, but the decision to put a defended settlement on that particular ridge, above that particular river crossing, was made around 914 AD by a woman governing a kingdom under military threat. She died 4 years later at Tamworth, in the town she had fortified herself. Her daughter was removed from power within months. Mercia was absorbed into the emerging kingdom of England. When Æthelflæd's specific political identity, as Lady of the Mercians, as a governing authority in her own right, was subsumed into the larger narrative of English unification under the Wessex dynasty. But the towns remained. They were too useful to abandon, too well-positioned to be replaced. The garrisons became populations, the markets became permanent. The streets she had cut through unfamiliar ground became the streets that subsequent generations walked, built on, named, and took for granted. The logic she had applied, fortify the high ground, control the river crossing, establish a market at the gate, proved durable across centuries of political change. That is how urban history works. The decisions of individuals become the constraints within which subsequent generations live. The walls Æthelflæd raised are long gone. The timber houses inside them rotted centuries ago. But the street lines she chose, the river crossings she secured, the positions on the landscape that she identified as worth defending, these persist in the places that grew from her decisions. She governed Mercia for roughly 15 years. In that time, she built more towns than most rulers of any gender built in a lifetime. The England that emerged from the 10th century, unified, urbanized beyond its earlier form, organized around a network of defended market centers, was partly the product of her work. Not entirely, not alone, but substantially and documentably as a result of choices she made and had the authority and capability to implement. She is one of the most consequential urban planners in early English history. Almost no one knows her name.